So, good evening, everyone. I am Nachiketa Mittal from Virtual Law School, and I welcome all of you for a very special lecture by Mr. Kapil Sibal, whom we all know. He's been at the helm of affairs in the law and politics, somebody who could be simply said to be legend of law and politics in India. We all have grown up in our respective times, especially even as I see myself and a lot of my youngest students, reading a lot of judgments, listening to his speeches, and also taking a lot of inspiration from Sir. So he's been at the helm of the Ministry of Human Resource Development, Law Ministry, Communications, and IT, and he has a very distinguished kind of, I would say, importance attached, as I see as a legal academic today, is that, sir, you have also been a lawyer working very closely with the bar and the bench, which makes it really important for me as a law teacher and for my law students as well to welcome to hear from you that what are your perspectives on the issues of constitutional law. And today, as we will hear from you about the unrealized constitutional promises, what are they? And to tell everybody in the audience, you may probably not know if you have not read enough about Sir. Sir is a wonderful, beautiful poet. And his lyrics were also sung in Shorgul's Tere Bina and Mast Hawa. So that's on a very different kind of a side of a lawyer that we all have known, speaking very robustly on different legal subjects, both inside the parliament, outside the parliament. And sir, it gives me a pleasure to also apprise you that I'm a law teacher. I was teaching for several years in National University of Orissa, and I was for a year being a dean in a state private university in Gujarat. And just last month, I sacrificed my job during the pandemic. And today, on 23rd of May, we have at the Virtual Law School completed 1 full month of pro bono law teaching. And it's been, my pleasure to accommodate over 500 students. And some of the, leaders from the bar and the bench who've supported has been Honorable Justice A.K. Sikri, Honorable Justice Corinne Joseph, Mr. Siddharth Luthra, Mr. Rajiv Luthra, Mr. P.K. Malhotra, Professor Manoj Kumar Sinha, Director of ILI, Professor Shanta Kumar, Vice Chancellor of GNLU. And to tell you, Justice Sikri has been teaching himself. And the CRPC course is taught by Justice Anand Pathak, who is a sitting judge of a High Court of Madhya Pradesh. So I'm very happy to share with you that, that we have today just completed another 1 course of India, which was taught by Mr. Abhijit Sinha, an arbitrator. So, and moving forward from the next month, I'm going to offer more classes for different other students who, sir, are not getting admitted to NLUs or other leading universities for want of fees, because that the fees is really, exorbitant. It ranges around 2 lakhs per year. I'm talking on a very lower side, in fact. Right, it goes from 10 lakhs to 15 lakhs for 5 years, and in fact, in some of the NCR leading state private universities, even to 30 lakhs and 40 lakhs. So, on that note, I have tried to make a difference as a law teacher to whatever best I can in these times of crisis, so the students can complete their semesters properly. And so, I'm happy to welcome you on board today. To be very clear, to be just an initiative of a law teacher with no backing of any business, corporate house, or even a state entity. So on, with those words, I welcome you on board, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me congratulate you personally for having started this initiative. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful initiative. You perhaps do not know that I started my career in life as a teacher, not of law, but really of history. I taught history in the Delhi University for 3 years, though I graduated from St. Stephen's as a history student. So I really appreciate the initiative that you have taken, and I'd be very happy to offer my services to you at any point in time to interact with students on topics that you wish me to take up in the course of that interaction. But coming to the topic for today, the unrealized constitutional promises. Well, I want to start off by saying that in politics, promises are always unrealized. That's the nature of politics. That's the nature of governance. And history has shown that every time there's a realization of a promise, there are new challenges that have emerged in that process. And those new challenges have to be addressed. And then new promises have to be fulfilled. So it's a never-ending circle where promises are fulfilled and new challenges come about. And that's always very interesting, because in politics, therefore, you're always being challenged because society challenges you, pressurizes you to fulfill those promises. You bring about legislation to deal with those challenges. After you bring about legislation to deal with those challenges, new challenges emerge. Take, for example, all of us want our life to be more prosperous, our lives to be more comfortable. And therefore, in that process, we need production of electricity so that we can perform our daily functions. But if your electricity production is based on fossil fuels, while you may achieve prosperity at the one end, there's environmental damage on the other end. So one realized promise leads to another challenge, which again, the promise with that is unrealized. It is true also of absolute governments, or governments who get absolute majority. We believe that when governments get an absolute majority, they are stable. They are stable in terms of policy prescriptions. But we've seen that while governments have absolute majorities, it also results in absolutism. So from one realized promise of a stable government, you have another challenge of absolutism. This is true of coalition governments. We feel that, coalition governments are the best. Why? Some people believe that, for the reason that there has to be discussion and dialogue before a decision is taken. But the nature of discussion and dialogue is such that sometimes decisions cannot be taken. So from a coalition government arises the need to have a complete majority. When you have a majority, then the challenge is it degenerates into absolutism. The point that I'm making is that these unrealized challenges or unrealized promises in politics are a permanent feature of the nature of politics. But when you come to constitutional law, when you come to court systems, then you realize that the court has been enjoined by the Constitution to fulfill the promises that were set out in the preamble of our Constitution, right? Which talks about justice, social, economic, and political. It talks about liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. It talks about equality of status and of opportunity. It talks about fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. These are constitutional goals that all courts, especially constitutional courts, must keep in mind, because we all know that these promises set out in the preamble of our Constitution are unrealized constitutional promises. So let me start off by saying that a country as diverse as India, a country as unequal as India, a country which has stratified social structures like no other country in the world, a country which is the cauldron of all races. It's a country which has the cauldron of myriads of languages, a country which is the cauldron of diverse cultures, like no other country in the world. So the challenges are really daunting. But when a constitutional court decides a question or is on the brink of deciding a question, I believe each constitutional court must have before it the basic fundamentals of what India is. Well, let me tell you that. There's a recent Forbes report. It says that 116 billionaires have wealth greater than the wealth of half the nation put together. The court should realize the enormity of the inequalities prevalent in India when it decides any question. 2, there's an Oxfam report in 2018 which says that 1% of India got richer by 39% by 2018, and the bottom half grew by only 2%. This tells you of the inequalities of wealth and of processes which generate wealth. Courts have to be concerned about this. 3, massive unemployment in this country. Courts must know that 80 crore people in this country earn less than 10,000 rupees a month. 80 crore people in this country means the population of Europe and the United States of America put together. That's the number of people who earn less than 10,000 rupees a month. That's the enormity of inequalities of India. As you know, that there is a massive unemployment in this country. Then there is a National Crimes Records Bureau, which tells you the extent of crimes committed against Dalits, against women, against minorities. So the crimes graph tells you the inequalities in the enforcement mechanisms of this country. So whenever a judge, a constitutional court, looks at any issue that it comes before, that judge and that court must realize that we are dealing with an unequal India. We are dealing with an India where minorities are targeted, Dalits are targeted, women are targeted, the marginalized are targeted, the unemployed are targeted, and more contemporaneously, the migrants are targeted. And if the court is alive to these issues, then it must abide by the constitutional principles that the court itself professes and has professed over the years. Now, let me tell you about some of those constitutional principles. Constitutional principle number 1, and this is reflected in a judgment of the court in 2008, State of Maharashtra versus Bhaurao Gawande. What is that constitutional principle? Elective despotism is what we have to fight. The Constitution did not give liberties to people and did not have an electoral system that would lead to elective despotism. And the court has to make sure that elective despotism does not infringe upon the liberties of people. That's a constitutional principle that the court itself has espoused. Number 2, the powers of government cannot be used to mutilate liberties. Again, a constitutional principle that the courts itself espouses. Number 3, a principle that was enunciated in Navtej Singh Johar in 2018. The court said, when fundamental rights are violated, courts cannot be mute spectators. Then again in 2018, in Shakti Vahini, the court said, when fundamental rights are violated, courts cannot choose the path of silence. And last of all, your fundamental rights cannot be scuttled by leaning on a philosophy. These are constitutional principles that courts themselves have enunciated. Now, look at recently. I mean, we can talk about recent phenomenon. Look at recently what happened in Kashmir. We all know that since August 4, 2019, till date, the freedom of more than 13 million people in Kashmir has been restricted. 30 million people. That's more than, it's about 1.3 crore people. And what has the court done? The court has chosen to turn their eyes the other way. The issues before the court have not been decided. In fact, I happen to have argued a case in the Supreme Court on orders issued by the government from time to time under Section 144 of the Code. And what was peculiar in that particular litigation was when the government filed an affidavit, they did not produce the orders that had been issued under 144 in each district. We asked the court to direct the government to produce those orders. The government in its counter affidavit said that we will only produce sample orders. And they did not produce the orders. Now, what would a constitutional court normally do? It would say, we directed you to produce the orders, produce the orders. The court did not do that. Then when the matters were argued, because as you know, under 144, after a certain number of days, the orders have to be renewed. We said, show us the renewed orders of district magistrates. On what basis were they renewed? The government was silent. So was the court. Then ultimately, after all this happened, at the end of the hearing, when we informed the court that this is all legal and that the orders could not have been issued in this fashion, and that the restrictions on the net, which has destroyed businesses in Kashmir, led to huge losses in Kashmir, where people have borrowed from banks and have had to pay interest and are continuing to pay interest and have lost their business completely. Who's going to compensate them? What the court did was something very interesting. The court laid down the principles, saying that yes, there can't be restrictions. If there are restrictions, there has to be proportionality. And the restrictions must serve the object sought to be achieved. And having said that, they asked the government, in the light of the principles that they have laid down, what does that tell you? The court was asked in a 32 petition to judicially determine whether the orders of magistrates were legal or not, whether the restrictions imposed on the internet were legal or not, whether such restrictions can be imposed on the government en masse, 13 million people, and whether those restrictions are reasonable, because you must assume that they are reasonable unless you come to the conclusion that each person in Kashmir is a potential terrorist, right? There is no way the court could have come to that conclusion. So the point that I'm making is, if you lay down a principle that when fundamental rights are violated, you can't be a mute spectator, but then why are you a mute spectator? Is the question that we have to ask. And why have you allowed yourself to be a mute spectator? I mean, I think it is, to some extent, the judgment that we got was something that we should be proud of. At least some principles were laid down. But the whole purpose of moving the petition was lost because we never got any relief. This is true of the recent 3G and 4G issue in Kashmir as well, because the matter has now been referred to a special committee. And the special committee is going to determine what the court should determine. Because the jurisdiction of the court under 32 is to determine all these issues, whether 3G is necessary, 4G is necessary for people to exercise their fundamental rights. And if there is an abridgment and there's a restriction, is that reasonable? All that the court had to determine. Now, the special committee is to determine, and who are members of the special committee? Government people. So Is the court not a mute spectator? So if you lay down a constitutional principle, then I'm afraid that that constitutional principle must be given full effect too, not just in one judgment, but in all issues that come before you. Now, the other problem that I wish to place is that in the Kashmir issue, and I will elaborate this issue in a minute. Before the hearing ended, the court was handed over some material in a sealed cover. And naturally, that sealed cover was not shown to us. Now, this practice of a sealed cover being handed over to the court on the ground that this has material dealing with the security of the state, and therefore it cannot be revealed to the participants in the judicial process, allows the court to be influenced by material which is not shown to the other side, which is a basic violation of the principle of equality. Because if I don't know what is being shown to the court which is against me or might be against me, then I have no way to rebut it. And the court can then be influenced by material which I have not been able to rebut. So the principles of natural justice are per se violated. Now, there is a provision in the Evidence Act that qua certain documents, courts, governments can claim privilege. So if you want to rely on a document and you file it before the court and claim privilege, then that issue of privilege will be argued. And if the court comes to the conclusion that this is a privileged document, it need not be shown to the petitioner. But if the court comes to the conclusion it is not a privileged document, then it has to be shown to the other side. Now you jettison that process, which is the process of law, provided under the Evidence Act. You hand over sealed material to the court, don't allow the other side to see it, don't claim privilege. Now, this process is unknown to law. How the Supreme Court and how the high courts in this country are allowing this process to go forward is something that I've never been able to understand. This is more so when individual liberties are at stake. And I've seen that happening in many cases. In one of the recent cases that I've been arguing, where my colleague, Mr. Chidambaram, was in custody for a long period of time. The practice of the government was not that the government had produced an affidavit in court saying that this is what has been found against my colleague, but that the investigation is going on, and I'm going to hand over to you a sealed cover of what is going on. I can't show it to the other side for the simple reason that the other side will get to know the manner in which that other side is being investigated. And that's not in the interest of the investigation. So I can put any material in a sealed cover to the court. The court will look at that material, get influenced by that material. I'll not be able to rebut it. And in a sense, the whole process of natural justice would have been violated. Now, unfortunately, this process is not known to law. This process is not known to law at all. In fact, if you look at the Code of Criminal Procedure, you will find that a case diary which is confidential is not evidence in the eyes of law. The court cannot rely on that case diary as evidence. For example, if the prosecution records a statement under 161, right? That's not evidence till that statement is made in a court of law on oath. So the judge, the trial judge, cannot rely on that 161 statement. He can only look at it only for the purposes of determining that the investigation is going on in a proper fashion. But he can't rely on that statement against the interests of the accused. And that's set out in the code itself. Now, that is also given a go-by to. And what is handed over to the court, we don't even know whether these are case diaries or not, because case diaries normally the court never asks for. Unless the court itself asks for a case diary, the prosecution doesn't give the case diary to the court. It's the court which asks for a case diary. This way, it's the other way around. The government, the prosecutor, gives material to the court, which whether it's a case diary or not, we don't know. And the court then looks at it, relies upon it, and if it does rely upon it, renders a judgment against the accused, which is contrary to all principles of law. Now, in what manner is then the court protecting our constitutional rights? And why has the court not ruled on it? Why? And this is an issue which has been raised time and again before the court. This also happened, if you remember, in the Rafed matter. That again, the court was handed over this in a sealed cover procedure. And our illustrious ex-Chief Justice of India was more than happy to receive it. But be that as it may, I'm not on individual issues. This is a procedure which is unknown to law. And if the court says that once fundamental rights are impacted, we will not be mute spectators. And if the court says that we will not allow liberties to be mutilated in this fashion, then the courts must address these issues. So that's one serious issue that I wish to raise before you and through you to young people who are listening to me and lawyers who are listening to me. The other concern that I have with the court of late is the court seems to be postponing issues that are of great national significance. And these are issues of the moment. Why they are doing so, we don't know. If you remember, and this is what I have said publicly, and not just many people, Parliament have said publicly, that the whole decision to demonetize high-value currency was a decision which was in thought, constitutionally impermissible, according to the petitioners. And that it ought to have been taken up by the court as quickly as possible. But what did the court do? That announcement, if you remember, was made by our Prime Minister, our dear Prime Minister, on the 8th of November 2016. And we are in the month of May 2020. That litigation is pending for 4 years. Why has it not been taken up? There must be some reason that courts must give as to why these litigations are not taken up. I think the court owes it to the people of this country. Because even if the court has the discretion not to take it up, and I believe the court does have, but that discretion has to be judicially exercised. Why it did not take it up? Why it's not necessary to take it up? Why is it constitutionally impermissible to take it up? And I think there should be a mechanism through which matters of moment, especially the one which dealt with demonetization, has not been taken up so far. Why have the issues of electoral bonds not been taken up? Now, this electoral bond process is an opaque process through which people can, through mechanisms that we'll only get to know once this matter comes up before the court, can purchase electoral bonds and give it to political parties. We do know that more than 90% of these electoral bonds are in favor of one particular party. I have no quarrel with that. But the question is that if the constitutional validity of that process has been challenged and has been pending in court, the court must answer us as to why that matter has not been taken up and why other matters of greater moment are being debated in court or intended to be debated in court, while these are put under the carpet. And what it does is, you see, when courts do not take up these matters, then within the public mind, there is naturally a suspicion that perhaps there is a reason for it. And if the public is not aware of that reason, then it will speculate a reason. And speculation in this domain is not in the interest of the judiciary. So it is in the judiciary's own interest that these matters of moment are taken up. And if not taken up, some kind of explanation, not that the court needs to give an explanation, but some kind of explanation is in the public domain, or at least a roster can be published that, yes, we will take up these matters in this month, maybe in 2021, I don't know, but we'll take it up at a given point in time. And this is of great importance when you really look at the obligations of the court when you talk about political justice. If people have raised the issue of electoral bonds, raised the issue of Kashmir, raised the issue of Article 370, so both under the Constitution and under the Citizenship Act, religion has never been made the basis of grant of citizenship. If I am a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh or a Christian or a Zoroastrian or a Parsi, that has nothing to do with term of residence. Can be a resident of this country, and residence is the basis for grant of citizenship. For the first time in our country, they are entitled to citizenship. We have no quarrels with that proposition. We have no quarrels with that proposition. The question is that persecution is a matter of fact. And persecution has to be established as a matter of fact. And none of these people have established persecution as a matter of fact. In fact, most of the people who came from Bangladesh to Assam were people who said that they had been residing in Assam much prior to 1971 or to 1975. And this is not even part of the statute. So all these issues are highly controversial constitutional issues. And the fact that the CAA has not been taken up at all, like the electoral bonds issue, like demonetization, like Article 370, makes one feel that at some level, the court has chosen to postpone these issues. The court has chosen to, in a sense, quote unquote, abdicate the urgency of dealing with these issues and left it for posterity to deal with them. And the problem is the nature of the court. And that's the next issue I want to come to. You see, this court is not one constitutional court. It's several constitutional courts because they sit in benches. And when they sit in benches, each bench, when it pronounces on a judgment, represents the Supreme Court. So every bench, when it pronounces a judgment, is representative of the entire court. That creates problems on their own, unlike the United States of America, where the courts sit as one whole. They all sit together. This is not the case here. So this creates contradictions between judgments. Sometimes one judge doesn't want to follow the other judge's judgment, or renders a judgment which is contrary to the other judges. Not willfully, but perhaps, they're not aware of it. So this is part of the problem, because it leads to a lot of confusion, because the high courts do not know what judgment to follow, because the law is not clear. Remember, for the law to be enforced, it must be clear. And for the law to be clear, the judgment must represent the will of the court. That's practically not possible in the context in which the court functions. Part of the problem, and I come to the next issue, is the issue of the master of the roster. This is something that I have been against because what happens in that process is this is the only order in the entire constitution. This is the only executive order that cannot be challenged. That in fact must not be challenged. Why it must not be challenged? Because it comes from the Chief Justice of India. And the Chief Justice of India is symbolic of the wisdom of the court. And therefore, it would be unfair for a lawyer to start challenging these orders. But in order to bring credibility into the system and confidence to the litigant public, through which the management of the roster is not an individual's decision. The management of the roster is so made that the matter can come up in any court depending on the nature of the matter. Once a discretion is given, then it creates problems again, because disgruntled elements within the litigant public start rendering opinions which are unsavory and which are not acceptable in many instances. So I think the court must, and this is not something that I have said, this is something that many people, many legal luminaries have talked about. And that's something that needs to be addressed by the court, because that impacts liberty. It impacts fairness. It impacts the duty of the court to deal fairly with all matters. I mean, there are people who are arrested for having put up posts in the social media, arrested for offenses for sedition and other things. While a person against whom an FIR is lodged in Maharashtra files a petition under Article 32 in court at 8:30 in the evening, and the matter is listed at 10:30 in the morning. For all those who are already arrested under sedition for having posted something that is critical of government have no recourse to a court of law. But a person against whom an FIR is pending, and that's all that there is, suddenly gets his matter listed on the next day at 10:30. Now, there must be a reason for that. I'm not questioning that reason. But the issue is, how does the lay public react to this? An ordinary person who comes to court challenging an FIR, the contents of an FIR, and you all know, you as young lawyers know, you as students of law know, that the law set down in Bhajan Lal and forward thereafter is the following: that if you read the contents of the FIR, and if you accept all the contents of the FIR, which you have to, and it results in the prima facie commission of a cognizable offense, then that FIR has to be registered, and it must either result in a closure report or in prosecution, in a final report to prosecute. A person by whom there is an FIR, which is registered, and clearly that FIR, the disclosure of the FIR constitutes an offense. He doesn't go to the High Court, he comes straight away under 32. I want to know, if an ordinary person had come to court under 32, what would have happened to him? His matter would never have been listed. I am aware of a fact that when the liberty of my colleague, Mr. Chidambaram, was being jeopardized, we came to court under 136, not even 32, and matters were not listed. So somewhere down the road, there must be uniformity in dealing with matters. And that's very important, because that enhances the credibility of the court. The other issue is that habeas corpus petitions, which under the law laid down by the Supreme Court, have to be dealt with the moment they are filed, are not dealt with for weeks and for months. We know for a fact that many of these petitions have not been dealt with, which arise out of Kashmir, have not been dealt with, which again is inconsistent with the law laid down. And the whole jurisprudence in criminal law, bail not jail, has been reversed on its head. It's now jail, not bail. And there are statutes, several provisions, several statutes, which say that if you are being prosecuted under that particular statute, then unless the prosecutor is heard, notice is given to him in advance. And unless the court finds that the individual is not guilty of the offense, bail will not be granted. Now, how is the court at that stage to find that the person is not guilty of the offense when the trial has not taken place? Now, these kind of provisions have been upheld by the court. If the court is the sentinel of the Constitution, if the court is the protector of the Constitution, if the court epitomizes constitutional values that need to be protected, if the court is the only protector between executive absolutism and fundamental rights, and protector of those fundamental rights, then courts must look at these issues. And what I find is somehow the government seems to have more credibility with the court than individual citizens. I have noticed that in the course of my career, and I've been here for more than 45 years. And it's sad that we have reached a stage where these issues are not being addressed. I come last of all, there are many issues I can talk about, but last of all, I come to the migrants issue. Now, I just want to give you a flavor of what the law on this is. We know that there's a national disaster. Now, whether it is man-made or it's natural, only an inquiry will tell. But given the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic, there is an act called the National Disaster Management Act of 2005, which deals with all these issues. Under this act, the national government, that is the union government, has to set up what is called a National Disaster Management Authority, which is presided over by the Prime Minister of India with 9 nominees of the government. And that National Disaster Management Authority is to be advised by the National Executive Committee, which is headed by a Secretary of the Government of India. And that is in turn helped by a committee of experts or experts in the field for the preparation of a national plan to deal with the disaster. And that national plan has to be adopted by the National Disaster Management Authority, headed by the Prime Minister. And that is at the central union level. And there have to be state plans at the state level and district plans at the district level. And all this is to be coordinated under the Act by the Union of India. Now, those coordinated mechanisms is to make sure that everything is done according to the national plan. Well, the fact of the matter is we have no national plan, right? And that's a constitutional issue. That's been raised before the court. The other thing, and this is something that young students may not know, under Section 12 of that Act, the government of India has to lay down, or the authority has to lay down, minimum standards for shelter for the migrants, minimum standards for food, minimum standards for medical facilities, minimum standards for sanitation. All that is prescribed in the Act itself. Right? None of this has been done. And what we are being told now is it's the state's responsibility. People are walking hundreds of kilometers. A young girl of 15 rode a bicycle and took her father, her ailing father, from Haryana to Darbhanga in Bihar. People have died. 16 people died on a rail track. Now, none of this is dealt with. And I'm afraid even in times of war, the voice of the court is not muted. Courts are not silent in times of war, even in times of war. Now, these are issues that it's time for us to place before the public. Because I think we all must know that in times like these, institutions have to rise to the level at which they can perform their constitutional obligations to the satisfaction not of individuals, but to the satisfaction of the laity, of the public at large. That yes, the government is doing its duty, the court is doing its duty, institutions are doing these duties. Now, I have not had time, and I think the time is over. I could have talked about the election commission, the enforcement agencies, and many other issues, which there's no time to talk about, but I leave it on another day. But these are some of the issues that I am deeply, deeply concerned with. And I thought that this is an ideal occasion for me to place them before all those who are listening to me today. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. It's been my distinguished pleasure to host you for a reason that, which I got to discover today through you, that you have also been a teacher. And that's what, we as legal academics say, that law teachers speak after the courts have spoken. Because it's the law teachers who assess the judgments. It's the law teachers who make the students understand the niceties and nuances of looking at the judgments, piercing through that what have gone through, not just merely looking at superficially, but actually fixing the constitutional duties of the courts too. So in that regard, what you have touched upon is something very important, that not just as a lawmaker or as a lawyer, but also perhaps in stepping into your shoes of a law teacher, that how we should look at fixing the accountability of the constitutional courts. It's not just, talking about the vicious circle, as you initially said, that the promises may remain to be unfulfilled because of a number of reasons, right? That be it the government, which is a full majority government or coalition government, there can be a number of factors and permutations, combinations together taken up. But at the same time, why should we negate that there's something or somebody which is called as the constitutional court, and they should probably have their own sense of duty? Couldn't there be possibility of having branches of the Supreme Court? That when we say that they are already sitting in the benches, and every bench virtually is a Supreme Court, and which I believe one of the very latest judgments is Sushila Agarwal versus Union of India. Why was the necessity from Gurbakh Singh Sabya to KL Verma, Salahuddin, Siddharam Mahatre, all talking about in different benches of anticipatory bail, and then Supreme Court on 20th of January again picking it up? And I, as a law teacher, teaching CRPC for a long while, I would say that 1980s judgment of Gurbakh Singh Sabya was virtually right. But what was the necessity that 2 judges or 3 judges in KL Verma was virtually ruling, overruling the 5 judges in Gurbakh Singh Sabya? I mean, these are all, live issues, and the number of them, which we all have seen over the years, right? So in that regard, I think it's been a wonderful that you came up, with such kind of clearly holding the courts accountable and talking about it, which I see so seldom happening. Probably one of the reasons, if I could add, is that judges appoint themselves. That, where is the accountability issue? And we as the law teachers are quite vocal and talking about it. And today I find, our voice to be further strengthened by, the punches that you have given us to the law teachers, that, these are issues. Why don't you as law teachers and law students write, research, and publish? Right. So on that note, sir, if you permit, I can allow the students to ask questions. In fact, some of the professors of constitutional law have also joined in. Yeah. So what I propose, students and the friends, is that please raise your hands and I'll be happy to unmute you. Or if you can do that, then one by one, we will take up a few questions. Okay. So Nilang, Soni, you go first.
Good evening, sir. I'm Nilang. So my question is that when you talk about privileged documents, so sir, in Supreme Court, in the case of Rafale, the figure of the equipment that is used in national security, it is the purpose of national security, sir, then how it has to be revealed to another party? Wouldn't it be unfair on that part, sir?
No, I think that there are several very complex issues involved in this kind of a sealed cover procedure involved. You see, you don't have to, what is to be protected is intellectual property. What is to be protected are technicalities of the equipment. Now, for example, you say that you have a gun, the price of which is X. This kind of gun, the price of which is X. That doesn't expose the government to national security concerns. So I think, yes, intellectual property, that which can impact national security concerns must be protected, but not everything will affect national security concerns. So I think that's the distinction that has to be made.
Right. Thank you. Harshit, do you want to go
Thank you,
ahead?
sir.
Yeah, Harshit.
Am I audible, please?
Yes, go ahead, Vita.
Thank you. So my question to you is simple. After the abrogation of Article 370 and the way Kashmir has been dealt with by the current government, what is a political or a legal remedy available for the people in Kashmir at this point of time to actually go ahead and, regain their trust in the constitution of our country, if they ever are to?
Well, I really cannot answer that question. That's a question that has to be answered by the people of Kashmir. All that I am here looking at the functioning of the court and commenting on the functioning of the court by saying that these issues need to be addressed. How the government of India will build confidence in the minds of the people of Kashmir is the task of the government of India. How the people of Kashmir will react to that is something that the people of Kashmir will decide. All that I can say is that the die having been cast, 370 having been abrogated, these issues are constitutional issues and need to be addressed by the court and decided by the court. Even if the court were to decide those issues one way or the other, the issue ultimately, the political issue is the confidence of the people of Kashmir and how you build that confidence so that they are fully integrated into the life and politics of India, right? We want Kashmir is an integral part of India, nobody can deny. But we also want Kashmiris to be integrally a part of us in every sense of the word. Now how that is to be achieved is a political process, not a legal process.
Right.
Thank you so much. Obliged.
So, Professor Yogesh Pratap Singh, do you want to go ahead? So we have Professor Yogesh Pratap Singh, who is the Registrar of the National Law Institute of Odisha with us, a constitutional law professor. Yes, sir, you can go ahead, please. Professor Yogesh, can you hear me, sir? Okay, we move.
Good evening, sir. I thank you for your enlightening lecture. And as a student of constitutional law and as a teacher of constitutional law, I also raise all these questions, some of these questions in the class, and I also write in the various portals and newspapers. What I find, sir, is very disappointing with this court, some of the issues which you have raised, where the Supreme Court judges and the High Court judges are all following the same footprints, where they directly praise the executive. We have number of instances. If we see in the past, we find one or two, but it has increased now by many fold. Consistently, we are finding high political cases where government is involved, government has high, all going in the favor of the government. Corruption charges in the Supreme Court, in the High Court. There is a sexual harassment case against the former Chief Justice of India. All these issues, if we see the recent current COVID crisis and the Supreme Court judgment, Supreme Court's attitude on the migrant workers, where they said that we can't do anything. This is our job. You go to the government. We can't help. If somebody is not listening, we can't ask them. So, do you think that we are in the same situation which we faced during 1975 emergency, when Supreme Court failed us badly, and in spite of all the faith and trust people have on the Supreme Court and High Court, I think that we are now facing the second emergency right now.
Well, I really don't want to compare 1975 to today. The reason is that the situation is substantially different, structurally different. I think after the communications revolution, the nature of the state has changed. The nature of the protection to citizens has changed. And I think there's a paradigm shift that has taken place in the nature of the state. The state has become very, very powerful. And with an absolute majority, the government is also exceptionally powerful. The worry that I have is, and I'm in agreement with you, the worry that I have is that not enough voices within the legal community are speaking up. And you know, I am one of those few. Why do lawyers not speak up? Because they are worried, because they have to appear in court every day, and they have to persuade the court to give them orders every day. And so they worry that if you raise these issues, they may not get orders. So in fact, the silence of the legal fraternity is as worrying as the non-action by the courts on many of these issues. But history will tell you that perhaps this was the worst period in the judicial history of India. And that at some stage, people within the court did not stand up to the government.
Thank you. Yeah. Muskan, do you want to go ahead quickly? Keep your question very brief so that Sir can answer timely. And yeah.
Good evening, sir. So, what is your take on mechanism of recusal of judges, as it is completely on the discretion of particular judges? We don't have any particular stringent method in the constitution.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's one of my concerns, and I wasn't able to address it because the time was short. But if a judge recuses, the judge must give reasons, and there must be a written reason. You see, what happens in court is the following, and I'll tell you, and we've experienced it. We go to court, and suddenly, out of the blue, one of the judges says, "I can't hear this case." And then it suddenly goes to another court. And we don't know why it went to the other court and why the judge recused. So I think there must be some method or some sort of convention developed. Because if somebody has approached the judge, then the person who has approached the judge must be dealt with. If somebody has not approached the judge and the judge is recused on his own, then we must know why he is recused. If he has an economic interest in the matter, he must give that reason. If he has any other interest, a friendship, he must give that reason. But if without reason he recuses, then again speculation takes place, which is not good for the court. So there should be a convention that should be developed in this regard.
Sir, but my point of concern is there are instances where a judge should recuse. For example, the case of Justice Arun Mishra, where ideally he should recuse because of the existence of apparent bias in the case of Land Acquisition Act, but he didn't recuse. So what is your take on that particular?
I think there is a judgment of the court on that issue.
Yeah.
And I think that we cannot question that judgment. And I don't think you should make allegations against a particular.
Right. Right. Yeah. Palash, do you want to go ahead? Keep your question very precise.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Sir, thank you for sharing your experience with us. Sir, do you think in India it is possible to have simultaneous polls again? And if yes, does it seriously affect the federal nature of the constitution?
Well, that's a question that has to be answered by the court. Not by me. That issue has not yet come up before the court because the issue of simultaneous elections has not been favored so far by both the Election Commission as well as the Law Commission. And the government is to take a call on it. I think there are highly difficult constitutional issues that will arise, and governments which have lost confidence of the House will continue. And that's antithetical to all constitutional principles. But be that as it may, that's my personal opinion, and I don't think that's relevant. And when and if that issue comes up, the court will hopefully urgently deal with it.
Right. Okay. Can we take a few more questions?
Sure.
Yeah, Shekhar, please go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, sir. So my question is that now that we all are seeing that the independence of judiciary is being questioned, like, has the independence been lost or it's maintaining the same independence? So, sir, I want to ask you, what is your view on this independence of judiciary?
No, see, it's like this. You cannot, with one brush, sort of paint all judges in the court with the same brush. I don't think you can do that. I don't think that's fair also. What we are seeing are instances of non-action. The reasons for non-action are not being disclosed. So then that raises suspicions, right? And the fact that the government seems to, that what the government says seems to have been is accepted by the court more often than not, right? And the manner in which proceedings are being conducted occasionally gives, leads to some concern. But to say that the independence of the judiciary has been lost is too strong a statement. I think there are concerns that the court needs to address, and I think lawyers who are in the evening of their lives should articulate these concerns to strengthen the judicial processes and to protect the Constitution and the values underlying the Constitution.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Shubham, go ahead. Shubham Gupta.
Good evening, sir. My question in precise is that recently the nomination of the former CJ Ranjan Gogoi any criticism. My question is, in recent online lecture, he used the term activist judges. Those judges who take the work after post-retirement, commercial works. So what's your take on the term?
See, I don't want to talk about a particular judge. All that I want to say is that judges who were in that court, right, have an opinion about the ex-Chief Justice of India. I think their opinion matters more than mine.
Right. Yeah, to all my student friends, please take note of the fact that you must also refrain when you speak publicly from naming anybody generally for a reason, because that's also a matter of your responsibility to speak very carefully, right? So I really caution each one of you to frame your questions in such a way that we can talk about the conceptual understanding, because that's something which is going to stay with you, not about talking anybody personally. Right. So, Shreyansh, you want to go ahead?
Yes. Good evening, sir. Sir, in the start, you spoke about inequalities. So, how can we, as a law student, remove those inequalities?
You can't. A law student can't remove inequalities. They can question these inequalities. They can speak for these inequalities and say, you must ensure that there is equality. And wherever equality is violated, bring it to the notice of the court, and through the judicial process, get succor for those people by whom such decisions are taken for their protection. But only political and social processes can remove inequalities. Judicial processes can strike down on inequalities. They can't remove them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
That's a wonderful take, I must say, sir. That how you've linked up so in a structured way that judicial processes cannot remove, they can strike down, but there is a very detailed process which is probably beyond the court,
let me tell you, wherever the court tries to intervene in this fashion, the court does great harm to the institution. And 2G and Cole judgments are an example of that.
Right.
Where they tried to rectify inequalities, right? And the result is they damage the economy of the country. Right. So that's, in fact, the court should not be doing that. Court should strike them down and let the process move forward.
An interesting thing, how do you balance it out? How do you, cut through the fine line that you are only striking it down, not making an attempt to actually, do anything more?
That's right? Not your job.
Your jurisdiction, your job precisely stops there. Right. Wonderful thought on that.
So, in addition to that, sir, don't you think that it would take much more time?
One question from one student, there has to be parity. Everyone should get to, speak to sir. So with all due respect to all the students, please don't mind my words. I really, value and respect your enthusiasm.
Okay.
Right. Anushka, please go ahead. Okay. Aparna Shukla, you can go ahead. Gursheen?
Yes, so a very good evening, sir.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Gursheen.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask that, as sir rightly pointed out, that the CJI's decision cannot be questioned or changed, and there are so many issues which have not been taken up yet, which the Constitutional Court should take up. So, what are the possible solutions which sir can suggest us as lawyers, apart from TILs? What can we do on our part so that these problems are taken up rightly and these are resolved for all, for the general public?
I think that my advice to you is the following, that there are processes within the judicial system which will persuade courts to take up these matters. If you're a student, I think what you need to do is to empower yourself so that in the future you can take up these matters. Empower yourself in a fashion that you are wedded to law. You're wedded to the concept of justice. You're wedded to the concept of equality. You're passionate about making sure that wherever there is inequality, you will raise that issue. It may be at the level of the trial court, it may be at the level of the district court, it may be at the level of the High Court or the Supreme Court. Empower yourself. And empowering yourself means not just being wedded to the law, but empower yourself through acquiring knowledge, not just of the law, but of literature, of economics, of business, of finance, of history, of philosophy. That's how you empower yourself. And if you do that, you will be able to serve your client much better. At the moment, if you're a student, concentrate on that.
Right, thank you. Yeah, in fact, to tell you, sir, also surprise you that, on this particular issue, that how should the students speak? How should they frame their arguments coherently? Today morning, we had a very wonderful session by Mr. Yatindra Singh, on glossophobia, overcoming glossophobia. And we are now trying through the virtual law school to establish a club where the students can come forward. They may speak in any language. Language is only a vehicle to carry your thoughts.
Sure.
Right? So they can speak very clearly, debate out, reason out, and just overcome that sort of fear, especially as the law students. Because for the law students, the entire thrust is all about speaking freely, confidently, however, coherently. Right. We'll take two more questions, students. Varsha, you can go ahead.
Sir. Thank you very much.
Hi, sir. Good evening. So my question is not related to law. I was wondering if you could actually recommend certain books for lawyers, for law students, also the books that had a lasting impact on you, or you think everyone should read? Should most definitely read.
I think it's difficult for me to. I mean, I can give you any number of books. I have perhaps the largest library in the country of books. I can give you any number. I think what's important is you must look into yourself and find out what you're interested in. Each person, each individual, each law student is unique.
Yes.
Unique in every sense of the word. In other words, there's a genius in everybody. And to realize that genius is to realize what you are interested in. And once you know what you're interested in and what you're passionate about, then you should go ahead and read about that. Not read about any and everything. I can give you 10 books to read. That's of no use. First, find out and ask yourself what you are interested in. And then take my phone number, give me a call, send me an SMS and tell me, this is what I'm interested in. Can you tell me the books I should read? And I should give you the books that you should read on that subject. Okay?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much.
Sachin, you can go ahead, I think. Sachin, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, as we're talking about justice, I think the primary thing is access to justice. So when we are looking into the cases where Supreme Courts are trying these cases, so the concept which has been raised where one petition was being filed from one of an advocate in Puducherry, stating that there must be division of zones of Supreme Court so that the access of justice would be more easier to the public. So what's your view on that, sir?
Well, I have a somewhat different view. You can't have 4 Supreme Courts. Just necessarily to a Supreme Court. enough zones and 4 courts of appeal, which are the final courts, the access of justice will be realized. And there should be one constitutional court, which should hear the matter without the master of the roster assigning the matter to one bench or the other. So there should be one constitutional court from where the Court of Appeals issues which are constitutional arise before one court, and the Court of Appeals otherwise in the 4 zones are the final courts as far as facts and statutory law is concerned, and not constitutional issues. That's the way to deal with it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving your time talking to the students. Students, I'm really sorry, we'll not be able to take any more questions for paucity of time, but I really value your enthusiasm, and I understand that you all want to interact with sir, and that's how. In fact, if I were to be in your position as a law student, I would have rather bombarded, the host, that you're not allowing us to speak. But that's how the positions, shift. I really respect all of those thoughts. So in this dimension, I just want to add one thing, that I have for long years been working on Gram Nyayalaya. And my PhD was exclusively on the empirical work of Gram Nyayalaya, probably the only one, where I did empirical study of Gram Nyayalayas in the state of Odisha. And also as part of the UNDP projects, I worked in over 150 villages. So what I found that this is also access to justice for the rural poor has been one of the very unrealized, unfinished businesses of the constitutional courts. And recently there was a PIL file last year by National Federation of Fast Justice for the Gram Nyayalayas to be expedited. And I also, through one of my first students of the first batch of National University Odisha, who has represented me in this, so I treated myself as a party. But what wonders me that it's been over 6 months, and that PIL probably has been, I don't know, where is it? Probably, as you said, it will be taken up in posterity sometime in future, right? So that's also duty of the constitutional courts. When it comes to the rural poor, there's no response.
Oh, absolutely. I think structurally, we need a paradigm shift in the delivery of justice in this country. And I think that Gram Nyayalaya is a very, very important structural systems through which injustice can be addressed, or justice can be addressed at that level. And most of those disputes can be resolved through a consensual process, right? Which is societal based, rather than based on 2 sides fighting it out. Right. But the adversarial process has not really been a completely successful story in this country. And I think we need to shift at the ground level to a more conciliatory process, right? A consensual process. And I think Gram Nyayalayas are a way forward.
I think we have a very profound example in Privy Council judgment in case of Sitana versus Virana, right? So where the Privy Council clearly upheld that our system, societal justice of mutual sort of deciding the cases has been working wonderful. And in that case, in the family dispute, the even Privy Council didn't want to interfere. So we have even those kinds of processes well established, working fine, but probably need to be again tightened up or sharpened somewhere through the the courts at the lower level, right? So sir, thank you for coming today and lecturing to the virtual law school, which is an individual effort at the moment, and I'm continuing with this to move forward. And 4 weeks are over, by God's grace, and I must really thank all the judges. In fact, even on Monday and Tuesday, Mr. Siddharth Luthra is going to take regular classes on bail. So I'm sure if I could request you, but I'm not very sure about your schedule, if sometime you would want to take one of the classes, because this is a memory, this is something which will stay with the students for a lifetime, that they were taught by the legends. Although I know that I have not heard that you go to any law college or a law school as such, right? That's what I have known so far. Please correct me on that, but it's a virtual effort in this sort of a thing where it will save our time not to travel like that.
Sure.
Right. So thank you so much, sir. Once again, thank you all the participants, and please join me collectively in expressing gratitude to sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Nachiketa, sir, for giving me the opportunity to.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
It's your poem, by the way.
Thank you.